in the sleepy village of St. Mary's Hollow. A chilling crash from the ancient clock tower shatters the evening calm. Robert Hargreaves, the meticulous clockmaker, lies dead at its base, his watch frozen in time. Was it a tragic fall, or something darker? Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of secrets. A resentful apprentice, a desperate landlord, a secretive sister, and an obsessed historian. As clues like chalk dust, a hidden ledger, and deep boot marks tick toward the truth. One question grips the village: who pushed Hargreaves to his death? Dive into a classic Agatha Christie-style mystery where every second counts. Chapter 1. The tolling bell. The village of St. Mary's Hollow lay nestled in a gentle fold of the English countryside. Its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the soft light of an autumn evening. The ancient clock tower, its weathered stones crowned by a great bronze bell, stood at the village's heart, marking time with a rhythm as steady as the seasons. Its chimes were a comfort, a reminder that all was well until, at precisely 7 o'clock, a jarring crash shattered the twilight calm. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the vicarage window, paused her knitting. Her nimble fingers, usually so sure, hovered over the soft wool as her sharp blue eyes flicked toward the sound. She was visiting her dear friend, Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, whose cozy parlor was filled with the scent of lavender and the faint crackle of a fire. The vicarage, with its rose-covered walls, offered a perfect vantage point over the village green, where the clock tower loomed. "What on earth was that?" Mrs. Clement exclaimed, setting down her teacup with a clatter. Her round face, usually beaming, creased with worry. "That wasn't the bell's usual chime." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind already turning. "No, it wasn't," she said softly, her voice carrying the quiet authority of one who had seen much of human nature. "It sounded ... wrong." Before Mrs. Clement could reply, the parlor door burst open, admitting Constable Harrow, a young man whose ruddy cheeks were flushed with urgency. His helmet was askew, and his breath came in short gasps, as if he'd run across the green. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Clement," he said, nodding hastily. "There's been an accident. Old Mr. Hargreaves, the clockmaker, he's fallen from the tower. He's dead." Mrs. Clement gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Oh, poor Mr. Hargreaves. How dreadful. Fell, you say, from the clock tower?" "Yes, ma'am," Harrow replied, his eyes darting to Miss Marple, who sat perfectly still, her knitting now resting in her lap. "Found him at the base, all broken up. Must have slipped. Maybe the railing gave way. It's old, that tower." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though her expression remained serene. "Must have," she murmured, almost to herself. She rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and fixed the constable with a look that was both gentle and piercing. "Tell me, constable, when was Mr. Hargreaves last seen alive?" Harrow blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Well, I suppose it was this afternoon. The baker saw him heading to the tower around 5, said he looked his usual self. Grumpy, mind, but no different than always." "His usual self," Miss Marple repeated, her tone thoughtful. She glanced out the window, where villagers were beginning to gather near the tower, their shadows flickering in the lamplight. And yet, a fall from such a height, ... Most curious. Mrs. Clement, wringing her hands, turned to her friend. Jane, you don't think surely it was an accident? Mr. Hargreaves was getting on in years, and that staircase is ever so steep. Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost imperceptible. Accidents do happen, my dear, she said, but so do other things. She picked up her shawl, draping it over her shoulders with deliberate care. I think, Constable, I should like to see the Clocktower, if you don't mind, of course. Harrow hesitated, then nodded. Right, ma'am? No harm in it, I suppose. It's a sad business, though. As they stepped into the crisp evening air, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, sifting through the fragments of what she knew. Mr. Hargreaves, the village clockmaker, was a man of precision, his life governed by the tick and tock of his creations. A fall seemed untidy, somehow. She glanced at the tower, its silhouette stark against the fading sky. The bell tolled once more, a mournful note that seemed to linger. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. In St. Mary's Hollow, as in every village, secrets ticked beneath the surface, waiting for someone to wind them up. Chapter 2. The scene at the top the clock tower of St. Mary's Hollow loomed over the village green, its ancient stones weathered by centuries of rain and wind, yet standing resolute as if time itself had carved its approval into the masonry. The evening had deepened into a chill dusk, and the air carried the faint tang of damp earth and fallen leaves. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders, followed Constable Harrow across the cobblestones, her steps measured, but purposeful. Behind her, Mrs. Clement had insisted on coming along, clutching a lantern that casts wavering shadows on the path. The villagers, drawn by the commotion, hovered at a respectful distance, their whispers blending with the rustle of autumn foliage. The tower's base was a grim tableau. Mr. Hargreaves lay sprawled on the flagstones, his limbs at unnatural angles, his face pale and still beneath a shock of white hair. His coat, threadbare but meticulously mended, was splayed open, revealing a waistcoat pocket from which a shattered pocket watch dangled, its hands frozen at 10 minutes to 7. The sight struck Miss Marple as oddly poignant, a clockmaker, undone by time's betrayal. She knelt briefly, her sharp eyes scanning the body without touching it, noting the faint abrasions on his knuckles and a curious smudge of chalk dust on his sleeve. Poor man, Mrs. Clement murmured, her voice trembling as she held the lantern higher. To think he climbed that tower every day, only to meet such an end. Constable Harrow, shifting uncomfortably, gestured toward the narrow door at the tower's base. The staircase is steep, Miss Marple, old and worn, too. I reckon he lost his footing, or maybe the railing up top gave way. It's wooden, and none too sturdy. Miss Marple's lips pursed, a subtle sign of skepticism. Perhaps, she said, her tone mild but her mind already turning over the details. Shall we go up, Constable? I should like to see where it happened. Harrow hesitated, his broad face creasing with unease. It's a climb, ma'am, and not a pleasant one, with the dust and all. But if you're set on it, I am, Miss Marple replied, her voice carrying a quiet firmness that brooked no argument. She stepped toward the door, her small, neat figure belying the determination within. Mrs. Clement, with a nervous glance at the constable, followed, her lantern casting a golden glow into the tower's shadowed interior. The spiral staircase was indeed steep, its stone steps hollowed by generations of feet. The air grew thick with the musty scent of age, mingled with the metallic temps of gears and oil. Each turn of the spiral seemed to tighten the space, the walls closing in until the trio emerged onto a narrow platform at the tower's summit. The great bronze bell hung silent above, its surface etched with faint inscriptions, while the clock mechanism, a labyrinth of cogs and spring-sticked faintly in the gloom. A wooden railing, weathered and splintered, encircled the platform, offering a precarious barrier against the sheer drop to the flagstones below. Miss Marple's eyes swept the scene, taking in every detail with the precision of a watchmaker. The platform's floor was scuffed, not with the even wear of regular use, but with erratic marks, as if a struggle had taken place. Near the railing, a faint smear of chalk dust caught her attention, its pale streak stark against the dark wood. She bent closer, her fingers hovering but not touching, noting the texture fine like the chalk used to mark measurements or sketch designs. A few splinters lay scattered nearby, freshly broken, their edges sharp and unweathered. "Constable," she said, straightening, "these marks, do they not seem rather disorderly for a simple fall?" Harrow rubbed his chin, his brow furrowing. "Well, ma'am, I suppose he might have stumbled, grabbed at the railing, maybe kicked about a bit. Old men can be unsteady." "Unsteady," Miss Marple echoed, her tone thoughtful rather than convinced. She moved to the railing, peering over the edge to the ground below, where a small crowd still lingered. The drop was vertiginous, easily 50 feet, and the flagstones unforgiving. And yet, Mr. Hargreaves was a clockmaker, accustomed to this climb, a man of habit, surely, with a steady hand for delicate work. Mrs. Clement, clutching the lantern tightly, ventured closer. "Jane, you don't mean to say surely it was an accident? Who would wish harm on poor Mr. Hargreaves? He was a quiet soul, kept to himself." Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost wistful. "Quiet souls, my dear, often have the most interesting secrets." She turned to Harrow. "What can you tell me of Mr. Hargreaves' life? His acquaintances, his habits?" The constable shifted his weight, clearly unused to such probing from a visitor. "Well, ma'am, he was a widower, lived alone above his shop on High Street. Been the village clockmaker for nigh on 40 years. Folks respected him, though he wasn't one for chatter. Kept company mostly with his apprentice, young Thomas Reed. Then there's his landlord, Mr. Silas Baxter, who owns the shop and half the village besides. Hargreaves' sister, Clara, lives out by Willow Lane, but they weren't close, from what I hear. Oh, and Miss Evelyn Porter, the historian, she was always poking about, asking Hargreaves about the tower's history." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing each name with care, and his disposition. "Any quarrels or troubles?" Harrow hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Clement as if seeking permission to speak freely. "He could be sharp, ma'am. Stubborn, too. Thomas complained about low wages, and Baxter was sore about unpaid rent, 3 months behind, they say. Clara, well, she and Hargreaves had some falling out years back, though no one knows the details. As for Miss Porter, she and Hargreaves had words now and then. She wanted access to some old logbooks he kept, but he wouldn't budge." "Logbooks?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. "About the tower, I presume?" Mum. This place is older than the church, and Miss Porter's writing a book on the village. She's keen on every scrap of history she can find. Mrs. Clement shivered, her lantern casting flickering shadows across the gears. It's a dreary place, Jane. All this dust and darkness. I can't imagine why anyone would linger here. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the scuff marks, her thoughts turning like the cogs before her. Some might linger for reasons other than clocks, she said softly. She stepped back from the railing, her eyes catching a glint of metal in a corner, a small screw, its head worn but clean, as if recently dropped. She made no move to pick it up, but its presence lodged in her mind, another piece in the puzzle. As they descended the staircase, the constable leading the way, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. Mr. Hargreaves, a man of precision, had met a messy end. The scuff marks, the chalk dust, the broken splinters all spoke of something more than misstep. In her experience, accidents were rarely so convenient. She recalled a similar incident in St. Mary Mead, when old Mr. Pritchard had fallen from his barn loft after a dispute with a neighbor over a boundary fence. The truth, as she had uncovered, was seldom as simple as it appeared at the tower's base. The crowd had grown, their murmurs rising like a tide. The village doctor, a stooped man with wire-rimmed spectacles, was examining the body, shaking his head gravely. Miss Marple approached, her demeanor unassuming but her eyes missing nothing. "Dr. Grayson," she greeted, having met him at the vicarage earlier that week. "Have you formed an opinion on the cause of death?" The doctor looked up, surprised by her directness. "A fall, Miss Marple. Broken neck, likely instantaneous. Multiple fractures too, consistent with a drop from that height, and the abrasions on his hands?" she asked, her tone deceptively casual. Dr. Grayson frowned, glancing at Hargreaves' knuckles. "Could be from grasping at the railing, or perhaps he struck something on the way down. Hard to say without a full examination." "Of course," Miss Marple said, nodding politely. She stepped back, allowing the doctor to continue, but her mind was already elsewhere. The abrasions suggested resistance, perhaps a struggle, and the chalk dust on Hargreaves' sleeve had it come from the platform, or from another source. She thought of the suspects Harrow had named, the apprentice Thomas, who worked with tools and gears; the landlord, Baxter, whose impatience might have turned to violence; the sister, Clara, estranged, but perhaps not indifferent; and the historian, Evelyn, with her relentless pursuit of the past. Each had a connection to Hargreaves, and perhaps to the tower. Mrs. Clement, her face pale, touched Miss Marple's arm. "Jane, this is all so dreadful. Shall we return to the vicarage? I'll have Mary prepare some tea." Miss Marple smiled, patting her friend's hand. "In a moment, my dear. I should like to speak with the constable a little longer." She turned to Harrow, who was directing two village lads to fetch a stretcher. "Constable, was anything found near Mr. Hargreaves? Papers, perhaps, or personal effects, aside from the watch?" Harrow shook his head. "Just the watch, ma'am, and his keys in his pocket. Nothing else out of the ordinary." "Out of the ordinary," Miss Marple repeated, her voice almost a whisper. She glanced back at the tower, its silhouette now swallowed by the gathering dark. The bell tolled again, a single, mournful note that seemed to carry a warning. In St. Mary's Hollow, as in every village, the surface was calm, but beneath it lay currents of envy, greed, and hidden truths. Miss Marple's knitting might wait, but her mind was already at work, ticking as steadily as the clock above, ready to unravel the mystery of the clockmaker's fall. Chapter 3. The Apprentice's Tale. The morning sun filtered through the leaded windows of Hargreaves' clock shop, casting a lattice of light across a room brimming with the delicate machinery of time. Clocks of every sort, grandfather, mantel, cuckoo, lined the walls, their pendulums swinging in a silent chorus, each tick a reminder of the village's loss. Miss Jane Marple stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped lightly before her, her eyes taking in the ordered chaos of the clockmaker's domain. The air smelled of polished wood and machine oil, with a faint undercurrent of dust. Stirred by her entrance, Thomas Reed, the late Mr. Hargreaves' apprentice, stood behind the workbench, his lanky frame hunched over a half-assembled pocket watch. At 19, he had the awkward intensity of youth, his dark hair falling into eyes that flickered with unease. His fingers, deft despite their calluses, paused as Miss Marple approached, her footsteps soft on the worn floorboards. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she said, her voice gentle, but carrying that quiet clarity which so often disarmed. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." Thomas glanced up, his expression a mix of wariness and resignation. "No, ma'am," he said, setting down a tiny screwdriver, "just trying to keep busy. It's strange, without him." He gestured vaguely toward the empty stool where Hargreaves had spent countless hours. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the workbench, cluttered with gears, springs, and a small chalk stick used for marking measurements. "A sad business." "Indeed," she said. "I understand you were close to Mr. Hargreaves, working with him day in and day out." "Close as he'd let anyone be," Thomas replied, his tone guarded. He wiped his hands on a rag, leaving faint smears of oil. "He was a hard master, but fair. Taught me everything I know about clocks." She settled into a chair near the counter, her posture unassuming yet attentive. "It must be a great responsibility, carrying on his craft. I suppose you saw him often outside the shop as well. At the clock tower, perhaps." Thomas's fingers twitched, and he busied himself with straightening a row of tools. "Sometimes he'd go up there to check the mechanism, oil the gears. I went with him now and then, but he liked doing it alone, said it was his time to think." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and unyielding beneath her prim hat, noted the slight tremor in his hands. "And the day he died, were you with him then?" "No, ma'am." The answer came quickly, almost too quickly. "I was here, finishing a repair for Mrs. Langley's mantel clock. Left around 6, went home to my lodgings. Didn't hear about what happened till later." "I see," Miss Marple said, her tone as soothing as a lullaby, though her mind was anything but lulled. She glanced at Thomas's coat, hanging on a peg by the door. It was a rough woolen thing, stained with oil, and, curiously, dusted with faint traces of chalk, much like the smudge she'd seen on Hargreaves' sleeve and the platform's railing. "You must have been fond of him, despite his stern ways. No disagreements, I suppose." Thomas's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed to weigh his words. "We had words, once or twice," he admitted, his voice low. "About wages? Mostly, he paid me less than I thought fair, said I'd earn more when I proved myself. Got heated a week back, but nothing serious. I'd never He trailed off, his eyes dropping to the workbench. Never harm him, Miss Marple finished. Gently, her smile sympathetic but her gaze piercing. Of course not. Young men often have spirited discussions with their mentors. It's only natural. She paused, letting the silence settle, then added, "You didn't happen to visit the clock tower that evening, did you? To clear the air, perhaps?" Thomas's head snapped up, his cheeks flushing. "No, ma'am. Like I said, I was here, then home. Ask Mrs. Langley, she came by for her clock just before I locked up." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, though she filed away his defensiveness. "I'm sure she will confirm it," she said mildly. "And Mr. Hargreaves, did he seem troubled lately? Any visitors or unusual behavior?" Thomas hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of a gear. "He was quieter than usual, kept muttering about money, said he'd come into some soon. Didn't tell me more, but he was always private like that. Miss Porter was round a few days ago, asking about some old papers he kept. Got his back up, she did. And Mr. Baxter, the landlord, came by last week, shouting about rent. Hargreaves told him to wait, but Baxter wasn't happy." "Mr. Baxter," Miss Marple murmured, her knitting needles clicking faintly in her mind, though her hands remained still. "And Miss Porter. Interesting. Anyone else?" Thomas shook his head. "Not that I saw. He didn't have many friends, ma'am. Kept to his clocks." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt with a practiced motion. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. You've been most helpful." She moved toward the door, pausing to examine a cuckoo clock, its bird frozen mid-call. "Such intricate work," she said, almost to herself. "It takes patience, doesn't it? And precision. A single misstep can ruin everything." Thomas nodded, his expression uncertain. "Aye, ma'am, one wrong move, and the whole mechanism jams." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her smile enigmatic. As she stepped into the crisp morning air, the shop's bell jingling behind her, she felt the threads of the mystery tightening. Thomas's earnestness rang true, but his quick denial of visiting the tower, the chalk on his coat, and his admitted quarrel with Hargreaves lingered in her thoughts. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a lad much like Thomas, eager, resentful, and not above a fib when cornered. She would need to speak with Mrs. Langley to confirm his alibi, but already the clock of suspicion was ticking. The village green was bustling now, with market stalls setting up and children darting between carts. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the clock tower, its shadow stretching long across the cobblestones. Thomas's story was plausible, but the chalk dust nagged at her, a small detail that refused to align. She recalled the platform's scuff marks, the splinters, the screw in the corner, each a cog in a mechanism she was only beginning to understand. As she made her way toward Mrs. Clement's vicarage, her mind turned to the other players in this quiet drama: the landlord, whose greed might outweigh his patience; the sister, whose estrangement hinted at old wounds; and the historian, whose curiosity might mask a deeper motive. In St. Mary's Hollow, as in every village, time revealed all secrets provided one knew where to look. Chapter 4: The Landlord's Grievance. The Golden Fleece, perched at the corner of St. Mary's Hollow's High Street, was a hub of village life, its low beams and flagstone floor warmed by the glow of a fire that never seemed to die. Miss Jane Marple settled at a corner table, her small figure almost lost in the bustle of noontime patrons, farmers haggling over pints, shopkeepers exchanging gossip, and the occasional traveler nursing a mug of ale. She had chosen the inn deliberately, knowing that Mr. Silas Baxter, the landlord of half the village and Mr. Hargreaves' creditor, was a frequent visitor. Her invitation for tea had been accepted with a gruff nod, though she suspected his curiosity about her intentions outweighed his hospitality. Baxter arrived promptly, his heavy footsteps announcing him before he filled the doorway, a portly man. In his late 50s, he carried the air of one accustomed to command, his broad shoulders straining against a well-worn tweed jacket. His face, flushed from either the cold or his temper, bore the ruddy sheen of a man who indulged in life's comforts, though his small, darting eyes suggested a mind ever calculating profit and loss. He eased himself into the chair opposite Miss Marple, his bulk making the wood creak. "Good day, Mr. Baxter," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear, her hands folded neatly on the table. A teapot and 2 cups sat between them, steam curling in the cool air. "Thank you for sparing the time. I imagine you're a busy man, with so many properties to manage." Baxter grunted, his thick fingers drumming on the table. "Busy enough, Miss Marple. Sad business about Hargreaves, but life goes on, doesn't it? What's this about, then? You're not one for idle chatter, from what Mrs. Clement says." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost disarming, but her eyes missed nothing, the slight sheen of sweat on his brow, the way his gaze flicked toward the door, as if expecting an escape. "No, indeed," she said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "I find idle chatter so rarely reveals the truth. I'm interested in Mr. Hargreaves' affairs, particularly his financial ones. You were his landlord, I believe." "Aye, for his shop and the rooms above," Baxter said, accepting the cup but not drinking. "Been so for 10 years. Reliable tenant, mostly, till lately." His tone carried a note of grievance, as if the mere mention of Hargreaves stirred an old wound. "Lately," Miss Marple prompted, her head tilted slightly, her expression one of polite curiosity. Had there been some difficulty? Baxter's jaw tightened, and he leaned back, crossing his arms. 3 months' rent overdue, that's the difficulty. Hargreaves was always prompt before, but this summer he started making excuses. Said he'd pay soon, that he'd come into money. I gave him time, Morn. Most would, but a man's got his own bills to settle." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of her saucer. "Of course, it must be trying, managing so many obligations. Did Mr. Hargreaves say how he planned to settle his debt?" "Said he'd sold some fancy clock to a collector up north," Baxter replied, his voice gruff. "Worth a tidy sum, or so he claimed. Kept promising it'd clear everything, but I never saw a penny. Got heated, I'll admit. Last time we spoke, week ago, in his shop. Told him I'd have to take steps if he didn't pay by month's end." "Steps." Miss Marple's tone was light, but her eyes sharpened, catching the flicker of unease that crossed Baxter's face. "Legal steps," he said quickly, his flush deepening. "Eviction, maybe. I'm no bully, Miss Marple, but business is business. Can't let tenants walk all over you." "Naturally," she said, her smile unwavering. "And where were you, if I may ask, on the evening Mr. Hargreaves met his unfortunate end?" Baxter's fingers stopped drumming, and for a moment, the clink of glasses and murmur of voices in the inn seemed to fade. "At home," he said, his voice flat. "In my study, going over accounts, alone, before you ask. My housekeeper was off for the evening, and I don't keep a valet." "Alone," Miss Marple repeated softly, as if savoring the word. She sipped her tea, her gaze never leaving his face. "It's curious, isn't it, how often tragedies occur when no one is watching? Tell me, Mr. Baxter, did you ever visit the clock tower to discuss matters with Mr. Hargreaves, perhaps?" "Never," he said, too sharply. "No reason to. He did his tinkering up there, and I had no business with his clocks. Too dusty, too cramped. I'm a man of open spaces, Miss Marple." He forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow, and his eyes darted again to the door. Miss Marple set down her cup, her movements deliberate. "I see. And yet, the clock tower is such a central place, isn't it? A landmark, almost a symbol of the village. One might imagine a heated conversation spilling over there, especially if money were at stake." Baxter's face darkened, and he leaned forward, his voice low. "If you're suggesting I had anything to do with Hargreaves' fall, you're barking up the wrong tree. I'm a businessman, not a murderer." He fell, plain and simple. "Old man, rickety railing, what more do you need?" Miss Marple's expression remained serene, her hands folded once more. "Oh, I need very little, Mr. Baxter, just the truth, which has a way of ticking along, like one of Mr. Hargreaves' clocks." She paused, then added, "You didn't happen to notice anything unusual about him recently? Visitors, perhaps, or changes in his habits?" Baxter shrugged, his bluster returning. He was the same old Hargreaves, grumpy, tight-fisted. That historian woman, Miss Porter, was always sniffing around, wanting his papers. And his sister, Clara, came by once or twice, though they weren't on good terms. As for his apprentice, Thomas, the lad's got a temper, I'll tell you that. Heard him shouting at Hargreaves more than once. "Shouting," Miss Marple murmured, her mind cataloguing the detail. "How interesting. Young men can be so impulsive, can't they?" She rose, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you, Mr. Baxter. You've been most illuminating." He stood as well, towering over her, his expression a mix of relief and suspicion. "Not sure what you're after, Miss Marple, but I've nothing to hide. Good day to you." As he strode out, his heavy boots thudding on the flagstones, Miss Marple watched him go, her eyes narrowing slightly. Baxter's bluster was convincing, but his evasiveness, the quick denial of visiting the tower, the solitary alibi at her. She recalled a similar man in St. Mary Mead, a prosperous farmer whose debts had driven him to desperate acts, all hidden behind a veneer of respectability. Baxter's boots, she noted, were sturdy, their soles thick and grooved, not unlike the marks she'd seen on the clock tower platform. And his claim of being home alone, unverifiable, was as convenient as it was suspect. She stepped into the street, the autumn air crisp against her cheeks. The clock tower loomed ahead, its chime marking the hour with a clarity that seemed to mock the village's secrets. Baxter's desperation, his talk of steps, and his solitary evening painted a picture that refused to align with a simple accident. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the other Stomas with his chalk-dusted coat. Clara, whose estrangement might hide deeper motives, and Evelyn Porter, whose pursuit of history seemed almost feverish. Each was a cog in the mechanism of Hargreaves' death, and Miss Marple knew that, with patience, she would find the one that had slipped out of place. Chapter 5. The Sisters' Secret. The lane to Willow Cottage wound through the outskirts of St. Mary's Hollow, where hedgerows tangled with late-blooming wildflowers, and the air carried the faint sweetness of overripe apples. Miss Jane Marple walked with her usual measured step, her sensible shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. The autumn sun hung low, casting long shadows that danced across the cottage's whitewashed walls, its thatch sagging like an old hat. Clara Hargreaves, the late clockmaker's sister, lived here, a woman whose name had surfaced in whispers, tinged with the vague melancholy of familial estrangement. Miss Marple knocked lightly on the door, her small figure framed by the cottage's rose trellis, now bare save for a few stubborn thorns. The door opened to reveal Clara, a slight woman in her late 40s, her face pale and drawn, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken sorrows. Her dark hair, streaked with gray, was pinned haphazardly, and her shawl, worn but meticulously darned, slipped slightly as she gestured Miss Marple inside. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" Clara's voice was soft, with a nervous edge, and her smile flickered like a candle in a draught. Mrs. Clement said, "You might call. Please, come in. It's not much, but it's home." The parlor was modest, its furniture polished but faded, with a single vase of lavender on the mantel lending a faint, familiar scent. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her eyes noting the room's details, the cracked teacup on a side table, the neatly mended curtains, the absence of any clock, which seemed odd for a clockmaker's sister. "Thank you, Miss Hargreaves," she said, her tone warm but probing. "I'm so sorry for your loss. It must be a great shock, losing your brother so suddenly." Clara's fingers twisted her shawl, and she nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It is. Robert was, well, he was Robert. We weren't close, not these past years, but to think of him falling like that." Her voice faltered, and she reached for a handkerchief, its edges frayed but clean. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes remained sharp, catching the faint tremor in Clara's hands. "It's always hardest for those left behind," she said gently. "I understand you and Mr. Hargreaves had grown apart. May I ask why?" Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. "Oh, it was nothing dramatic. Just life, I suppose. After his wife, Margaret, passed, Robert buried himself in his work. Clocks the tower, always tinkering. He didn't have time for family, or perhaps he didn't want it. I tried to keep in touch, but he'd grown so distant, so stubborn. We had words a few years back, silly things, really, about money and old promises. I stopped trying after that." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the word money. "Family quarrels are often the most painful," she said. "But you saw him recently, I believe. In the village, perhaps." Clara's eyes flicked up, a flash of wariness crossing her face. "Once or twice, passing by his shop. I didn't go in. He didn't like visitors, not even me." She paused, then added, "I heard he'd come into some money from selling a clock. I thought maybe he'd reach out, but he never did. Money can complicate things, Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting to the lavender on the mantel. The scent was unmistakable, and she recalled the same fragrance near the clock tower's base. Faint but distinct among the dust and stone. In the evening he died. Where were you, Ms. Argreaves? Clara's fingers stilled, and she drew a sharp breath. In my garden, she said, her voice a touch too quick. I was weeding, tending the late roses. It's quiet work, keeps me busy. I didn't hear about Robert until the constable came by, after dark. Miss Marple's smile was kind, but her eyes noted the slight flush on Clara's cheeks, the way her hands resumed their nervous twisting. A garden is a great comfort, she said. I have one myself, in St. Mary Mead, though I find weeding leaves such a mestioc dust from the paths, especially. Your garden has a chalk path, I believe. Clara blinked, caught off guard. Yes, it does. The stones were crumbling, so I had them repaired last month. It does get dusty, I'm afraid. She laughed, a brittle sound, and rose to pour tea from a chipped pot. Would you like some, Miss Marple? It's only simple fare. Thank you, yes, Miss Marple said, accepting the cup. As Clara moved, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small parcel on a side table, half wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. It was unremarkable, yet its presence stirred a memory of the village gossip, a schoolboy, claiming to have seen Clara near the clock tower, carrying something similar. You must be busy, with your garden and all, she said casually. Do you often walk into the village? Not often, Clara said, returning to her seat. I keep to myself, mostly. The village is full of eyes, you know, always watching. Her voice held a trace of bitterness. Quickly masked by another fleeting smile, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind ticking like one of Hargreaves' clocks. Clara's story was plausible, her grief seemingly genuine, yet the lavender scent, the chalk dust, and the parcel nagged at her. She recalled a woman in St. Mary Mead, estranged from her brother over an inheritance, whose quiet demeanor hid a simmering resentment. Clara's estrangement, her nervous manner, and her proximity to the tower confirmed by a neighbor's sighting suggested more than she was willing to share. Did your brother ever speak of his troubles? Miss Marple asked, setting down her cup. With his apprentice, perhaps, or his landlord? Clara shook her head, her eyes distant. Not to me. Robert kept his own counsel. I heard from others that Mr. Baxter was pressing him for rent, and young Thomas wasn't happy about his wages, and that Miss Portershe was always after Robert's papers, those old tower logs. She'd come by the shop, pestering him. He didn't like it. Miss Porter, Miss Marple echoed, filing the detail away. How curious, this interest in old papers. Did you ever see them? No, Clara said, her voice firm. Robert was particular about his things. Kept them locked away, in the shop or the tower, I suppose. I never asked. She paused, then added softly, I wish I had, now might have understood him better. Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate, her smile warm but her mind alert. You've been very kind, Miss Hargreaves, sharing your memories at such a time. I shan't take more of your day. She paused at the door, glancing back at the parcel. You'll be sending that off soon, I expect. The postmistress is so reliable here. Clara's hand twitched, and she nodded. Quickly, Oh yes, just some old clothes, for a cousin in town. Nothing important. Her smile was strained, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before she stepped into the lane. The walk back to the vicarage was brisk, the autumn air sharp with the promise of evening. Miss Marple's thoughts turned over the encounter, each detail a cog in the mechanism of the mystery. Clara's grief seemed real, but her quick answers, the lavender scent, and the neighbor's sighting near the tower suggested a hidden thread. The parcel, too, was curious. Why so nervous about something so mundane? In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known sisters who harbored secrets behind their tears, and Clara's reticence felt all too familiar. As the clock tower's chime rang out, clear and steady, Miss Marple knew she was closer to the truth, but the mechanism was still out of balance, waiting for the right piece to click into place. Chapter 6. The Historian's Obsession. The Library of St. Mary's Hollow, a squat stone building tucked behind the church, was a sanctuary of musty books and polished oak, its shelves groaning under the weight of centuries-old records and modern novels alike. Miss Jane Marple stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through high, dusty windows. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and wax polish, and a faint chill lingered despite the fire crackling in the grate. She had arranged to meet Miss Evelyn Porter, the village historian, here, knowing the woman's passion for local lore might hold a key to the clock tower's secrets. Evelyn Porter was already at a long table, surrounded by a fortress of open books and scattered notes, her pen scratching furiously. A spinster in her early 50s, she had the sharp, bird-like intensity of one consumed by a singular purpose. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her spectacles perched precariously on her nose, glinting as she looked up at Miss Marple approach. Her walking stick, a sturdy oak affair with a brass handle, rested against the table, its tip scratched and worn, as if it had seen more than casual strolls. "Miss Marple," Evelyn said, her voice crisp, with a trace of impatience. "Mrs. Clement mentioned you'd be calling. I'm rather busy, but I suppose I can spare a moment." She gestured to a chair, her movements brisk, as if time itself were a precious artifact to be catalogued. Miss Marple settled into the seat, her hands folded neatly, her smile as disarming as ever. "How kind of you, Miss Porter," she said, her tone warm but laced with that quiet curiosity that so often unraveled secrets. "I've heard you're writing a book on St. Mary's Hollow, a commendable endeavor, preserving the past like that. I understand you were particularly interested in the clock tower." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained polite. "Yes, it's a cornerstone of the village's history. Built in 1587, you know, by a guild of clockmakers from London. Its mechanism is a marvel unique in its design, with records dating back centuries. I've been compiling its history, but Mr. Hargreaves was less than cooperative." Her lips pursed, betraying a flicker of resentment. Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze drifting to the pile of notes, some scribbled in chalk, others in ink. "Uncooperative? How so?" "He had the tower's logbooks," Evelyn said, her voice tightening. "Old journals, kept by the clockmakers who maintained it. They're invaluable details of repairs, inscriptions on the bell, even accounts of village events tied to the tower. I asked to see them, offered to transcribe them for my book, but he refused. Said they were private family papers. Ridiculous, really. They belonged to history, not one stubborn old man. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Evelyn's walking stick, noting the scratches on its tip deep, irregular, like those on the clock tower's wooden railing. It must have been frustrating, she said gently, to be so close to such treasures and yet denied. Did you ever visit the tower to discuss it with him? Evelyn's pen paused, and she adjusted her spectacles, her movements deliberate. Once or twice, she admitted. I thought I might catch him in a better mood there, away from his shop. But he was just as obstinate. Last week, we had quite a row about it. He all but threw me out. Her tone was bitter, but she caught herself, forcing a tight smile. Not that it matters now, poor man. Indeed, making conversation. And yet, such a tragedy. Did you see him that evening, by chance? Evelyn's jaw tightened, and she leaned back, her fingers tapping the table. No, she said. Firmly, I was at home, working on my manuscript. I had no reason to be at the tower that night. I'd given up on those logbooks, for the time being. Her voice was steady, but her eyes darted to her notes, as if seeking refuge in their familiar chaos. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind alert. Of course, she said. It's just that the tower holds such fascination. For you, one might imagine you'd linger there, hoping for a chance to persuade him. Evelyn's laugh was sharp, almost brittle. Linger in that dusty old place, hardly. I prefer my study, where I can work in peace. Besides, I had no quarrel with Robert beyond his stubbornness. I wished him no harm. She paused, then added, He was troubled, though. I heard him arguing with that apprentice of his, Thomas, about wages. And Mr. Baxter was hounding him for rent rather loudly, I might add. Even his sister, Clara, seemed to have some grudge, from what the village says. Miss Marple's smile remained gentle, but her eyes caught the faint smudge of chalk on Evelyn's sleeve, likely from her sketches of the tower's mechanism. The village does talk, she said lightly. Tell me, Miss Porter, these logbooks, were they kept in the tower or the shop? In the tower, I believe, Evelyn said, her tone cautious. He was very particular about them, always carting them up there. Locked in a box, he said, as if I'd steal them. She sniffed, her indignation resurfacing. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate. Thank you, Miss Porter. Your passion for history is truly inspiring. I'm sure your book will be a treasure for the village. She paused at the door, her gaze lingering on the walking stick. You must take great care with your research. Climbing those steep stairs, the tower can be treacherous, can't it? Evelyn's eyes flickered with something surprise, perhaps, or unease, but she nodded. It can. I'm careful, Miss Marple. As Miss Marple stepped into the crisp afternoon air, the library's heavy door thudding shut behind her, her mind was a whirl of cogs and springs. Evelyn's obsession with the logbooks was palpable, her frustration with Hargreaves evident. The scratches on her stick, the chalk on her sleeve, and her presence at the tower suggested more than scholarly zeal. Miss Marple recalled a vicar's wife in St. Mary Mead, whose pursuit of a rare manuscript had led to desperate measures. As the clock tower's chime echoed across the village, Miss Marple knew the mechanism of this mystery was still incomplete. But Evelyn Porter's fervor had just added another piece to the puzzle. Chapter 7. The Village Whispers. The tea shop on St. Mary's Hollow's High Street was a cozy haven, its windows fogged with the warmth of steaming kettles and the chatter of villagers seeking respite from the autumn chill. Miss Jane Marple sat at a corner table, her knitting resting in her lap, its needles silent but ever present, like an extension of her thoughts. The shop, with its checkered tablecloths and the faint clink of china, was the beating heart of village gossip, a place where secrets were traded as freely as scones. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and attentive eyes, was perfectly positioned to listen. Mrs. Tuttle, the postmistress, bustled over with a fresh pot of tea, her round face alight with the eagerness of one who thrived on news. "Terrible about Mr. Hargreaves, isn't it, Miss Marple?" she said, pouring with a flourish. "Falling from that tower such a shock, though I always said that place was a death trap, with those rickety stairs." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but her gaze sharp as she accepted the tea. "A tragedy for the village. Did you know Mr. Hargreaves well, Mrs. Tuttle?" "Oh, well enough," the postmistress said, settling into a chair uninvited, her apron crinkling. "He'd come by for his letters, always polite but never chatty. Lately, though, he seemed brighter, you might say. Mentioned a big sale, some rare clock to a collector in York. Said it'd set him right, clear his debts." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest, though her expression remained serene. "Debts? I suppose he had obligations, like many." Mrs. Tuttle leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, I owed Mr. Baxter 3 months' rent, and Baxter wasn't quiet about it. I saw him storm into the clock shop last week, red as a beet, shouting about eviction. And between you and me, Miss Marple, Baxter's not as flush as he lets on. Word is, he's borrowed heavily to buy up more properties. Desperate for cash, he is." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of her teacup. "How unfortunate," she murmured. "Money does complicate matters. Anyone else take an interest in Mr. Hargreaves' affairs?" Mrs. Tuttle's eyes gleamed. "Well, there's young Thomas Reed, his apprentice, always grumbling about his wages. My nephew heard him yelling at Hargreaves in the shop, bold as brass, demanding more pay. And then there's Clara, his sister. Keeps to herself, but I saw her near the clock tower a few days back, carrying a parcel. Looked furtive, if you ask me." "A parcel." Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her mind seized on the detail, recalling the brown paper package in Clara's cottage. How curious. And where was she headed? Toward the tower, or so it seemed, Mrs. Tuttle said, shrugging. Though what she'd want there, I couldn't say. She and Hargreaves barely spoke, from what I hear. Old family quarrel. Something about their parents' will." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts ticking like the clocks in Hargreaves' shop. Before she could probe further, Mr. Dobbs, the baker, approached, wiping floury hands on his apron. "Pardon, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "Heard you're asking about Hargreaves. Sad business. Saw him that afternoon. Heading to the tower. Looked his usual self, maybe a bit distracted. Didn't stop to chat, which wasn't like him. He'd usually have a word about my bread." "Thank you, Mr. Dobbs," Miss Marple said, her smile warm. "And did you notice anyone else near the tower that evening?" Dobbs scratched his chin. Come to think of it, I saw Miss Porter there, just before dusk. She was pacing about, muttering to herself, clutching that stick of hers. Seemed cross probably about those papers she's always on about. Hargreaves wouldn't give her the time of day, pardon the pun. Miss Marple's lips twitched, though her eyes remained intent. Miss Porter does seem devoted to her work, she said. Anyone else? Well, there was young Jimmy, the schoolboy, Dobbs said. He's always scampering about. Told me he saw Clara Hargreaves near the tower at dusk, same as Mrs. Tuttle said. Had a parcel, he claimed, and looked like she didn't want to be seen. As Dobbs returned to his counter, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the clock tower stood sentinel over the village. The gossip was a tapestry of half-truths and sharp observations, each thread weaving into the mystery. She thanked Mrs. Tuttle and rose, her knitting tucked under her arm, and stepped into the street, where the vicar, Mr. Clement, was passing by. Miss Marple, he greeted, his kindly face creased with concern. You're looking thoughtful, still pondering poor Hargreaves. Always, Mr. Clement, she replied, her voice light but her mind heavy with details. Tell me, you know Miss Porter well. Is her interest in the clock tower unusually fervent? The vicar sighed, adjusting his spectacles. Fervent's the word. She's obsessed with that tower, its history, those logbooks. Almost fanatical, I'd say. She came to me last month, asking if the church had any records about it. Seemed put out when I had none, and she was cross with Hargreaves, too. Said he was hoarding history that belonged to the village. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts aligning like gears. And the others, Thomas, Clara, Mr. Baxter. Any whispers from your flock, Mr. Clement hesitated, his pastoral discretion warring with his trust in Miss Marple. Thomas is a good lad, but impulsive. I've heard him complain about Hargreaves' stinginess. Clara, she's a lonely soul, keeps her pain private. As for Baxter, he's a man stretched thin by ambition. I've counseled him on his temper, especially where money's concerned. Thank you, Mr. Clement, Miss Marple said, her smile gentle but her eyes gleaming. As she made her way back to the vicarage, the clock tower's chime rang out, steady and clear. The village's whispers had painted a vivid picture. Baxter's debts, Thomas's resentment, Clara's furtive parcel, Evelyn's obsession. Each was a cog in the mechanism of Hargreaves' death, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, felt the truth ticking closer, waiting for the final piece to fall into place. Chapter 8. The Chalk Clutha. Late afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary's Hollow, casting a golden glow across the village green, where the clock tower stood like a silent guardian. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, made her way toward the tower once more, her steps deliberate, despite the chill in the air. The morning's conversations had woven an intricate web of motives and alibis, but the physical traces of Mr. Hargreaves' final moments beckoned her back to the scene. She had learned, in her many quiet inquiries in St. Mary Mead, that the smallest details, a footprint, a stray thread, a fan, spoke louder than words. Constable Harrow, ever obliging if somewhat bemused by her persistence, met her at the towers base. His broad face was creased with the weariness of a man unaccustomed to such disruptions in his peaceful village. Back again, Miss Marple, he said, tipping his helmet. Not much more to see, I'm afraid. We've cordoned it off. but the doctor's done with his examination, and the body's been moved. Quite so, Constable, Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle, but her eyes sharp as they scanned the flagstones where Hargreaves had fallen. The faint outline of chalk, used to mark the body's position, was still visible, smudged by passing feet but unmistakable. I find it helpful to revisit a place, to let it speak, as it were. Might we go up once more? Harrow sighed but nodded, unlocking the narrow door. Mind your step, ma'am. Those stairs don't get any kinder. The spiral staircase seemed steeper in the fading light, its stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. Miss Marple climbed with care, her hand brushing the cold wall for balance, her mind turning over the fragments of evidence she had gathered. The scuff marks on the platform, the splintered railing, the small screw in the corner all lingered in her thoughts. Alongside the chalk dust that seemed to follow this case like a shadow at the top, the platform was, as she remembered, cramped, dusty, with the great bronze bell looming above and the clock mechanism ticking softly in its iron frame. The wooden railing, weathered and splintered, encircled the space, its fragility a stark contrast to the tower's sturdy stone. Miss Marple's eyes were drawn immediately to the scuff marks on the floor, irregular and chaotic, as if two pairs of feet had danced a brief, violent waltz. She knelt, her fingers hovering over the marks, noting their depth and direction. They were not the random scrapes of a stumble, but the deliberate gouges of a struggle. "Constable," she said, her voice calm but laced with purpose, "these marks, have you considered what they might suggest? Not a fall, perhaps, but something more contentious." Harrow scratched his head, crouching beside her. "Well, ma'am, I thought maybe Hargreaves flailed about, trying to catch himself. But you're right, there, a bit wild for that. Could be he wasn't alone up here." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to the railing. The splintered wood, freshly broken, bore faint scratches, as if something hard had scraped against it. She recalled Evelyn Porter's walking stick, its tip marked with similar gouges, and Thomas Reed's coat, dusted with chalk. But it was the chalk dust itself, scattered in faint smears across the platform, that held her attention. She traced a streak near the railing, fine and powdery, like that used by craftsmen or scholars. "This chalk," she said softly, "it's curious, isn't it? Not the sort one finds naturally in a tower." Harrow frowned, peering at the dust. "Hadn't thought much of it, ma'am. Could be from Hargreaves' work, marking gears or such. His apprentice uses it, I know." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her mind ticking like the mechanism before her. "And yet, others use chalk as well. Miss Porter, for her sketches of the tower's workings, and Miss Hargreaves' garden path, recently repaired with chalky stones." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "But Mr. Baxter, the landlord, he has no such connection, does he?" "Not that I know of," Harrow said, his tone uncertain. "Baxter's a man of ledgers, not tools, though his boots are heavy enough to make those marks." He pointed to a deep gouge in the wood, its edges sharp and distinct, unlike the lighter scuffs around it. Miss Marple's lips pursed, a faint smile of recognition. She recalled the heavy tread of Baxter's boots at the inn, their soles thick and grooved, capable of leaving such impressions. She rose, brushing her hands lightly, and moved to the corner where she had spotted the small screw on her previous visit. It was still there, glinting faintly in the dim light, its head worn but clean, as if recently handled. She pointed it out to Harrow. "This screw, has it been examined?" Harrow shook his head. "Didn't seem important, ma'am. Could have come loose from the mechanism. Or maybe Hargreaves dropped it." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal but her mind alert. The screw was too small for the clock's massive gears, more suited to a delicate piece, like a pocket watch or a lockbox. She filed the detail away, alongside the chalk and the gouges, each a piece in the puzzle of Hargreaves' death. As they descended the staircase, the tower's shadows seemed to close in, the air heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Outside, the village green was quiet, the crowd dispersed, leaving only the faint hum of evening settling over St. Mary's Hollow. Miss Marple paused at the tower's base, her eyes lingering on the chalk outline where Hargreaves had fallen. The lavender scent she had noted before was gone, washed away by the damp air, but its memory lingered, pointing to Clara Hargreaves' presence. The screw, the chalk, the gouges, each clue was a cog, and Miss Marple felt the mechanism of the mystery beginning to turn. "Constable," she said, turning to Harrow, "might you inquire if anyone saw Mr. Baxter near the tower that evening? His alibi is rather solitary, wouldn't you say?" Harrow nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. "Aye, ma'am. I'll ask around." "You think there's more to this than a fall?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost wistful. "I think, Constable, that truth is like a clock, simple on the surface, but intricate beneath. We need only find the right spring to set it in motion." As she walked back to the vicarage, the clock tower's chime rang out, its note clear and steady, yet somehow mournful. The village's secrets were ticking closer to revelation, but Miss Marple knew patience was her greatest tool. In St. Mary Mead, she had unraveled many such mysteries, each with its own cast of characters, greedy, resentful, or obsessed. Here, with Thomas's chalk-dusted coat, Clara's furtive parcel, Evelyn's scratched stick, and Baxter's heavy boots, the pieces were aligning, but the final click remained elusive. Chapter 9. The Hidden Ledger. The clock shop of St. Mary's Hollow stood silent in the early morning light, its windows reflecting the pale glow of a sun still climbing over the rooftops. Miss Jane Marple paused at the door, her gloved hand resting lightly on the handle, her eyes scanning the familiar sign Hargreaves and Son. Clockmakers, though the sun had long been a relic of hope rather than reality. Constable Harrow had agreed to let her examine the shop, a concession made with a mix of respect and bafflement at her quiet insistence. She stepped inside, the bell above the door giving a soft, mournful jingle, as if aware of its master's absence. The shop was a labyrinth of time, its shelves and tables crowded with clocks of every description, ornate mantel clocks with gilded faces, sturdy oak grandfather clocks, and delicate pocket watches gleaming under glass. The air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and the faint tang of oil, undercut by a stillness that seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple moved carefully, her steps soft on the worn floorboards, her eyes darting from one detail to another. She had come not to admire the craftsmanship, but to search for something less tangible, a clue to the life and death of Robert Hargreaves. She began at the workbench, where Thomas Reed had stood only days before, his nervous hands betraying more than his words. The surface was cluttered with tools, tweezers, screwdrivers, a small chalk stick, but orderly, as if Hargreaves' meticulous nature lingered even now. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over a stack of invoices, their edges curling, detailing repairs and sales. Nothing unusual, yet she felt the shop held more. A secret tucked away like a spring in a clock's mechanism. Her gaze fell on a cuckoo clock mounted on the wall. Its wooden bird frozen mid-call, its weights dangling unevenly. Something about its placement struck her as odd, too high for easy access, yet within reach of Hargreaves' stool. She recalled a similar hiding place in St. Mary Mead, where old Mrs. Fletcher had concealed her savings behind a wall clock, trusting its familiarity to guard her secrets. With a gentle touch, Miss Marple lifted the clock from its hook, revealing a small recess in the plaster behind it. Inside was a slim ledger, its leather cover worn but intact, bound with a thin cord. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the neat, precise handwriting that filled its pages. It was not a shop record, but a personal account, detailing Hargreaves' private dealings. Entries noted the sale of a rare 18th-century Verge escapement clock to a collector in York, fetching a sum that made Miss Marple's eyebrows lift slightly, enough to clear any debt, with plenty to spare. Interspersed were notes of expenses. Rent owed to Silas Baxter, supplies for the shop, a small sum lent to Clara years ago, never repaid. One entry, dated a week before his death, caught her attention. Baxter came again. Threats of eviction. Will pay in full Friday. Friday, she noted, was the day Hargreaves had died. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind turning over the implications. The ledger confirmed what the village whispers had suggested. Hargreaves had the means to settle his debts, a fact he'd shared with Baxter. Had the landlord, impatient or doubting, confronted him that evening? She recalled Baxter's heavy boots, the deep gouges on the Clocktower platform, and his solitary alibi. As unverifiable as it was convenient, she tucked the ledger into her bag, intending to show it to Constable Harrow later, and continued her search. Beneath a pile of gear sketches, she found a small key, its head engraved with a tiny clock face. It was too delicate for the shop's front door, more suited to a lockbox or cabinet. She slipped it into her pocket, her thoughts drifting to the clock tower, where Evelyn Porter had mentioned logbooks kept in a locked box. Could this key be the link? And had Hargreaves' refusal to share those records provoked more than scholarly frustration? As she moved toward the back of the shop, where a narrow staircase led to Hargreaves' living quarters, she heard the door's bell jingle. Thomas Reed stepped inside, his lanky frame filling the doorway, his face paling as he saw her. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. "Didn't expect to see you here." Constable said the shop was locked. "So it was," she replied, her smile gentle but her eyes sharp. "He was kind enough to let me look around. I thought it might help us understand Mr. Hargreaves' last days. You don't mind, I hope?" Thomas shook his head, though his hands fidgeted at his sides. "No, ma'am. Just feels wrong, being here without him." He glanced at the workbench, his eyes lingering on the spot where the cuckoo clock hung, now slightly askew. Miss Marple followed his gaze, noting his unease. "You were here that afternoon, weren't you? Finishing a repair, you said. Did Mr. Hargreaves mention his plans for the evening?" Thomas hesitated, his fingers brushing an oil-stained rag. He said he was going to the tower to check the mechanism. Said he had business to settle after. Didn't say what, but he was cheerful, almost. Not like him. Business, Miss Marple echoed, her mind ticking. With Mr. Baxter, perhaps. About the rent. Thomas's eyes flicked up, a flash of wariness crossing his face. Maybe Baxter was always after him. Came by that morning, actually banging on the door. Hargreaves told him he'd have the money by nightfall. Didn't say how. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts aligning like gears. And you, Thomas. After you left the shop, you went straight home. He said, too quickly. Like I told you, Mrs. Langley came for her clock. Then I locked up and went to my lodgings. Didn't hear about what happened till later. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tones soothing but her eyes catching the faint chalk dust on his coat sleeve, a detail that refused to fade from her mind. She thanked him and stepped into the street, the ledger and key weighing lightly in her bag but heavily in her thoughts. The village was stirring now, with market stalls opening and children darting across the green. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the clock tower, its chime marking the hour with a clarity that seemed to challenge the secrets it held. The ledger confirmed Hargreaves' windfall, a motive for Baxter's impatience, perhaps enough to turn a heated argument into something deadly. The key suggested access to the logbooks Evelyn coveted, while Clara's estrangement and Thomas's resentment lingered as shadows in the mechanism. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had uncovered truths hidden in ledgers and locked boxes, and here she felt the same quiet certainty. The pieces were falling into place, but the final spring was yet to be found. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The vicarage parlor, with its chintz curtains and softly ticking mantel clock, was a haven of warmth against the chill of the late October evening. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual chair by the fire, her knitting untouched in her lap, her sharp blue eyes surveying the room with quiet authority. She had requested Constable Harrow to gather the suspects Thomas Reed, Silas Baxter, Clara Hargreaves, and Evelyn Porter for what she described as a little chat. Mrs. Clement, ever the gracious hostess, bustled about with tea and biscuits, her nervous glances betraying her unease at the gathering's purpose. The suspects arrive one by one, each bringing their own air of tension. Thomas, lanky and fidgety, hovered near the door, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his coat still bearing faint traces of chalk dust. Baxter, his broad frame filling the armchair, sat with a scowl, his ruddy face betraying impatience. Clara, her frail figure wrapped in a faded shawl, clutched her handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously. Evelyn Porter, her spectacles glinting in the firelight, leaned on her scratched walking stick, her expression a mix of curiosity and defiance. Constable Harrow stood by the mantel, his notebook at the ready, his broad face creased with anticipation. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but carrying a weight that silenced the room. "I know this is a difficult time, with Mr. Hargreaves' tragic death so fresh, but I believe we can shed light on what happened that evening in the clock tower. Truth, you see, is like a clock. It requires all its parts to work in harmony." Baxter shifted, his chair creaking. "What's this about, Miss Marple?" "The constable says it was an accident. Old man, old tower case closed." Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost wistful. So it seemed, Mr. Baxter, but certain details suggest otherwise. She reached into her bag, producing the slim ledger she had found in the clock shop. This, for instance, records Mr. Hargreaves' sale of a rare clock, a sum sufficient to clear his debts, including the 3 months' rent he owed you. He intended to pay you that very evening, did he not? Baxter's flush deepened, his eyes narrowing. He said he'd pay, yes, kept promising, but I never saw the money. Doesn't mean I did anything to him. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her gaze unwavering. Let us consider the scene at the tower. The platform bore scuff marks erratic, as if from a struggle. The railing was splintered, with scratches suggesting something hard, like a walking stick, had struck it. She glanced at Evelyn, whose grip on her stick tightened. And there was chalk dust, faint but unmistakable, like that used by a clockmaker, or perhaps a historian sketching diagrams, or even from a chalky garden path. Clara's handkerchief twisted in her hands, and Thomas's shoulders stiffened. But Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. Thomas, you quarreled with Mr. Hargreaves about wages, and your coat carries chalk from your work. But your alibi, confirmed by Mrs. Langley, places you at the shop until 6, then home. Miss Porter, your passion for the tower's logbooks led to arguments, and your stick bears marks like those on the railing. Yet you were home, working, you say. Clara, you were seen near the tower at dusk, with a parcel, and the lavender scent at the tower's base matches your cottage, but you claim to have been gardening. Evelyn's voice cut in, sharp and defensive. This is absurd. I wanted those logbooks, yes, but I'd never harm Robert. I was at home, as I said. Clara's voice trembled. I was in my garden. I didn't go near the tower. Whoever saw me must be mistaken. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her focus remained. And yet, Mr. Baxter, your situation is most curious. You were desperate for Hargreaves' rent, with debts of your own pressing. Your boots match the deep gouges on the platform, and your alibi alone at home is unverifiable. The ledger shows Hargreaves was ready to pay you, yet you claim he refused. Did you meet him at the tower to press your case? Baxter's face darkened, his hands clenching. I told you, I was home. You've no proof I was there. Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her words were precise. Proof, Mr. Baxter, lies in the details. The gouges suggest a heavy man, not a frail sister or a scholarly spinster. The struggle on the platform was brief but violent, and Hargreaves' abrasions suggest he fought back. You argued, didn't you? He laughed, perhaps, or refused to pay immediately, and in your anger you pushed him. The room fell silent, the fire's crackle the only sound. Clara's eyes welled with tears, Thomas stared at the floor, and Evelyn's spectacles glinted with shock. Baxter's bluster faltered, his shoulders sagging. It wasn't meant to happen, he muttered, his voice low. I went to the tower, yes, to get my money. He said he'd pay, but not yet laughed in my face, said I'd wait. I grabbed him, just to shake sense into him. He slipped, fell over the railing. I didn't mean to kill him. Constable Harrow stepped forward, his notebook forgotten. Silas Baxter, you're under arrest for the murder of Robert Hargreaves. Miss Marple sat back, her hands folded, her expression one of quiet pity. The mechanism of the mystery had clicked into place, its cogs aligned by the small, overlooked details. Chalk gouges a ledger's truth. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such moments where desperation turned to tragedy. And here, in St. Mary's Hollow, human nature proved no different. Chapter 11. The Confession, the Vicarage Parlor. Moments after Silas Baxter's faltering admission seemed to hold its breath, the fire's glow cast flickering shadows across the faces of those gathered, each frozen in their own tableau of shock, sorrow, or silent reckoning. Miss Jane Marple remained in her chair, her small figure a calm anchor amidst the storm, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes reflecting a quiet pity rather than triumph. The air was thick with the weight of truth, the kind that, once spoken, could not be unwound. Like a clock spring snapped beyond repair, Clara Hargreaves, her frail hands clutching her handkerchief, let out a soft sob, her shoulders trembling, as tears spilled down her pale cheeks. "Oh, Robert," she whispered, her voice breaking, "to think it came to this." Her words trailed off, lost in the tide of her grief, and Mrs. Clement, ever compassionate, moved to her side, offering a gentle hand on her shoulder. Thomas Reed stood rigid by the door, his youthful face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief, his hands, still faintly smudged with the chalk of his trade, hung limp at his sides, as if the weight of Baxter's confession had drained his usual restless energy. Evelyn Porter, her spectacles catching the firelight, gripped her walking stick tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her scholarly composure had cracked, revealing a flicker of shame, perhaps for the fervor that had driven her to clash with Hargreaves over mere papers. Constable Harrow, his broad frame looming by the mantel, cleared his throat, his voice steady but heavy with the gravity of the moment. "Mr. Baxter," he said, stepping forward, "you'll come with me now. We'll need a full statement at the station." His tone was firm, but his eyes held a trace of reluctance, as if the act of arresting a man he'd known for years sat uneasily with him. Baxter, slumped in his armchair, seemed to shrink further, his ruddy face now ashen. "It was an accident," he muttered again, his voice barely above a whisper, as if pleading with himself as much as the room. "I didn't mean for him to fall. I needed that money." He laughed, said I'd get nothing till he was ready. I grabbed his coat, shook him, then he was gone, over the railing. I didn't push him, not like that. His hands, thick and calloused, covered his face, muffling his words. I panicked, left him there, thought they'd call it a fall. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her sharp eyes missed nothing, the slump of Baxter's shoulders, the tremor in his hands, the desperate edge to his confession. She had seen such moments before, in St. Mary Mead, where greed or fear could twist a man's actions beyond his intent. "Desperation," she said softly, almost to herself, "has a way of clouding judgment. A moment's anger, a single act, and the consequences tick on forever." Clara looked up, her tear-streaked face turning to Miss Marple. "Why didn't he just pay?" she asked, her voice raw. "He had the money. You said so. Why taunt Mr. Baxter like that?" Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her words were precise. "Your brother, Miss Hargreaves, was a proud man, wasn't he? Perhaps he resented Mr. Baxter's demands, or perhaps he wished to assert his own control. Pride, like greed, can lead to missteps. She paused, then added gently, "But he did not deserve such an end." Evelyn Porter shifted, her stick tapping the floor lightly. "And the logbooks?" she asked, her voice sharp but tinged with guilt. "If Robert had shared them, none of this might have happened. I only wanted to preserve the tower's history." Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost admonishing. "History is a powerful lure, Miss Porter, but it must never outweigh human kindness. Your pursuit was honest, but it pressed Mr. Hargreaves in ways he could not abide." Thomas, finally finding his voice, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Baxter. "You let me think it was my fault," he said, his tone low but fierce. "I argued with him, yes, but I'd never hurt him. You let the village whisper about me, about Clara, about Miss Porter, while you hid what you'd done." Baxter's head remained bowed, his silence a confession in itself. Constable Harrow placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him to his feet. "Come along, Silas," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "We'll sort this out properly." As Baxter was led from the room, his heavy boots thudding on the polished floor, the parlor seemed to exhale. Clara's sobs quieted, though her hands still trembled. Evelyn set her stick aside, her shoulders sagging as if relieved of a burden. Thomas lingered by the door, his expression a mix of relief and lingering anger. Mrs. Clement, ever practical, began collecting the tea things, her movements a quiet effort to restore normalcy. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt with a practiced motion. "A sad business," she said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "But truth, once found, brings its own kind of peace." She turned to Clara, her eyes gentle. "You'll carry on, my dear. Your brother's memory deserves that." Clara nodded, her lips trembling into a faint smile. "I'll try, Miss Marple, for Robert." As the others dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the fire, her thoughts turning over the case's final cogs. The chalk dust, the gouges, the ledger. The lavender central had pointed to Baxter's desperation, a moment of rage that had ended a life. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such tragedies unfold, each driven by the same human frailties. Here, in St. Mary's Hollow, the clock tower's chime would ring again, but its echo would carry the weight of a lesson learned too late. Chapter 12. The chime restored. The morning sun rose over St. Mary's Hollow, its light filtering through a veil of mist that clung to the village green. The clock tower, its ancient stones softened by the dawn's glow, stood as resolute as ever, its great bronze bell gleaming faintly under the lifting fog. The chime, which had faltered on the night of Robert Hargreaves' death, rang out once more, clear and steady, marking the hour with a rhythm that seemed to promise renewal. Miss Jane Marple stood at the vicarage gate, her small suitcase packed, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders as she prepared to return to St. Mary Mead. The village, though scarred by tragedy, was stirring back to life, its heartbeat measured by the tower's restored toll. Mrs. Clement, her round face softened by affection, fussed at Miss Marple's side, pressing a small parcel of homemade scones into her hands. "Oh, Jane, must you go so soon?" she said, her voice tinged with regret. "You've done so much for us, sorting out this dreadful business. I don't know how we'd have managed without you." Miss Marple's smile was warm, her blue eyes bright with the quiet satisfaction of a task completed. "My dear, you'd have managed, as villages always do," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "The truth has a way of ticking to the surface, like a clock that only needs winding." Across the green, the clock shop's sign caught the light, its letters freshly polished by Thomas Reed, who had taken up the mantle of the village clockmaker. The young man, his lanky frame bent over the workbench, had found purpose in preserving Hargreaves' legacy. Miss Marple had seen him earlier that morning, oiling the tower's mechanism with a care that spoke of respect, perhaps even atonement, for the quarrels that had marked his apprenticeship. The chalk dust on his coat, once a shadow of suspicion, was now merely a mark of his trade, and his earnest eyes held a new determination to honor his mentor's craft. Clara Hargreaves, too, had found a measure of peace. Miss Marple had visited her at Willow Cottage the previous evening, finding her in the garden, tending her late roses with a steadiness that belied her grief. "I'll keep the shop going," Clara had said, her voice soft but resolute. For Robert, he'd have wanted that. The parcel she had carried near the tower, Miss Marple learned, was indeed old clothes for a cousin, a detail confirmed by the postmistress. The lavender scent, a fleeting clue, had been no more than a coincidence of her passing by. Her estrangement with her brother, a wound that would heal with time, not malice. Evelyn Porter, chastened by the revelation of her own fervor, had approached Clara with an offer to catalogue the tower's logbooks for the village archives, a gesture of reconciliation that Clara had accepted with a tentative smile. Miss Marple had seen Evelyn in the library, her scratched walking stick set aside, her notes now focused on preserving history rather than pursuing it at any cost. The scratches on the stick, it turned out, were from her own climbs up the tower stairs, not a struggle, and her obsession had been just that, a passion, not a motive for murder. Silas Baxter, now in custody, awaited trial, his confession a weight that had lifted the village's suspicion from others. Constable Harrow had confided to Miss Marple that Baxter's debts, far greater than rumored, had driven him to desperation, his confrontation with Hargreaves a tragic miscalculation born of greed and frustration. The deep gouges on the tower platform matched to his heavy boots, and the ledger's promise of payment had sealed his fate. A reminder that even the most prosperous facade could hide a crumbling foundation. As Miss Marple walked toward the station, the village green bustling with market days, early preparations, she paused to glance at the clock tower one last time. Its chime rang out, a single note that seemed to carry both mourning and hope. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where similar tragedies had unfolded, each driven by the same human frailties: pride, greed, resentment. Here, in St. Mary's Hollow, the mechanism of truth had been wound by small details, a ledger's entries, a boot's mark, a moment's loss of control. Human nature, she murmured to Mrs. Clement, who had insisted on accompanying her to the platform, is much the same, whether in a village or a city. We all tick to the same rhythm, don't we? Mrs. Clement nodded, her eyes misty. You see it so clearly, Jane. I suppose that's why you always find the truth. Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost enigmatic. I only listen, my dear. The truth speaks for itself, if one has the patience to hear it. She boarded the train, her suitcase light but her mind rich with the lessons of St. Mary's Hollow. As the engine whistled and the village receded, the clock tower's chime faded into the distance, a final note in a mystery solved, leaving Miss Marple ready for whatever puzzle awaited her next.